amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald.
My guest today is Megan Norris, a UK trained journalist and renowned freelance writer and award-winning author of 7 books. Megan specialises in real-life crime, and her articles and books cover some of Australia's most infamous cases, including the aftermath of the Port Arthur massacre. She is a regular contributor to national magazines, has appeared on many TV channels, and her work has been syndicated worldwide. One of her books, which she co-authored, Perfect Victim, has been made into a movie starring Sam Neill, Miranda Otto and Guy Pearce. Megan lives on the Gold Coast with her husband Steve, their grandson and their dog Larry. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you with us, and I believe it's not the first time that you have been involved with print handicap radio. When you were a student in England, you told me you volunteered at the school for the sight impaired, and in the days before computers, you wrote down the examination answers verbatim for those who were sight impaired. So how did you get involved there?
Oh, I think as students we were asked to volunteer. I would have been in year 11, I think, and we were asked to volunteer to help with our peers who were living with a disability. In that case, it was visual impairment. Right. And so those were the days where they could read the paper in Braille, but I would write down the answers verbatim, and you couldn't help. You couldn't do anything. You had to write exactly what they said. Oh, in the days before computers.
Even if you knew they were totally wrong.
Well, I hadn't done the research they had, so they knew their stuff.
Right.
Oh, they knew their stuff, and there was a high pass rate. It was great.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah.
And so when did you decide that you'd like to be a writer?
Always. Always. I think I would have been about 9 years old. I grew up in England, and my mum and dad would go off to do the shopping, and Dad kept the sleazy tabloids, Sunday tabloids, under his armchair seat. And when they were out, I would fish them out. And I would read the News of the World, which was a terrible publication, with a small pocket Collins dictionary, looking up words like dismembered, disemboweled, decapitated. And I had a repertoire of really grim phrases like, her headless torso was found in a shallow grave. So I always knew I wanted to be not just a journalist, I wanted to be a crime reporter. Right. And we used to watch this show called Dixon of Dock Green, which was an old Bobby on the beat. And he was always sort of had a journalist in a dirty mac, a dirty raincoat, following him round. I wanted to be that person.
Oh, gosh. And you started off in newspapers and in the magistrate's court, is that right? Yes.
Well, I start off at the training school. I was one of 12 young people to get a cadetship, 2 girls, 10 young guys. This was the 70s. And
a time of shorthand and typewriters.
I learned shorthand and typing. I was brilliant at shorthand, 140 words a minute.
Oh, wow.
And so I was told I'd make someone a good secretary, but I didn't want to be a secretary. I wanted to be a crime writer. But I remember doing general news and all of that sort of thing till you got good at it. And one of the older women in the office had come back from maternity leave, and she asked me if I'd like to go to court with her. Or she rather told the editor, she's coming with me. Yeah. And she pointed to me, and she took me to court. And from the minute I walked in and sat on the press bench, it was like, this is where I need to be. It's like I found my happy place.
And was it a man's world pretty much at
that
totally.
Stage?
Yes.
It was
yes.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, you know,
no place
no.
for women.
And that was one of the reasons I liked covering court, because I could get away from the office and all the stuff going on there. It was a madhouse. You know, when you learn to write news, you're learning to write news in an environment with a lot of big egos, a lot of shouting and arguing and swearing, and they pulled no punches. Men take no prisoners. You know, someone would say, this is absolute rubbish. Who wrote this?
Right.
And
it took a lot of guts to be in there, I would think. Yes.
And I'd be in the middle of a phone interview. I might be interviewing someone doing a phone story, and the editor would look at the clock, see that it was 10 a.m., and he'd bang his cup with a spoon and say, tea time, and everyone in the newsroom joined in. And I had to be the one that made the tea because I was the girl.
Oh, you're joking.
Yeah.
Gosh, wouldn't be in this day and age, would it?
No.
But that was in England. So then you came out to Australia. When did you come to Australia?
We emigrated here in 1990. So I'd done 17 years of courts by then, and I covered every court. So I quickly progressed from Magistrates Court to Crown Court, which is sort of the equivalent of Supreme Court here.
Yeah.
And then I went on to Court of Appeal, High Court, inquests. I did everything. I even did a court-martial, which is pretty rare. I don't know anyone else who's done a court-martial in Australia because the Army or the Defence Forces don't tell you, and they certainly don't want you in. reporting on it. But anyway, I was marched in by these soldiers and it was quite intimidating. But I came here and I realised that I figured out quickly, we went to Melbourne, that there were only about 5 court reporters on the Herald Sun court team. Right. One from The Age. Yes. There was one at Magistrates Court and another reporter covering Crown Court, the Supreme Court. So I thought, how many magistrates' courts are there? And there were about 20 in Melbourne. So I decided, well, they can't be everywhere. There's only 5 of them. So I decided to cover the courts that they couldn't get round. And I would be selling my court copy to daily papers, to television, to Channel 9, Sunday papers. And then I got enlisted by The Truth. I don't know if you remember The Truth. It was a dreadful, salacious...
I do remember it, yes.
Dreadful, salacious publication, very similar to the ones I was reading at 9. So I decided... I got a call from them saying, those cases that you've covered, you've left a lot of stuff out. I mean, is it grim? Is it dirty? Is it too awful for public consumption? I said, pretty well. And they said, right, we'll pay you for all the unprintable stuff that you're not writing about.
Oh, okay.
We'll pay you.
Right.
So I earned a lot of money out of The Truth.
Yeah, well, that was a good start forward there. And from there, now you went on to writing articles for, say, the Woman's Weekly and other national magazines throughout Australia?
Yeah, I got a call from the features editor at one of the mags saying, you've written a court case, you covered the court case about a woman who'd got a rare disease that made her steal things. I mean, lots of things, house full of things. What's that about? And I said, well, she's got OCD and, she's got other mental health issues. So they said, would you do a story on what drove the crime? So I started to look at the behind the scenes of the crime.
Right.
Rather than the crime itself. So I'd cover the court case, the actual crime and what happened to them.
Yes.
But then I was looking at what drives crime, and that evolved into writing the survivors of violent crime. So I would see these people in a murder trial, the parents, the family, and they would be sitting there every day. They'd come every day for a 6-week trial, and they would hear the most awful evidence. I can't even imagine how hard that would be, listening to the final moments of someone you really love.
Oh, it would be dreadful.
And especially in domestic violence murders where they're not here to defend themselves. So the perpetrator will trash their reputation, say just anything, and there's no one there to refute it.
No.
So they don't have a voice. And so I sort of took a U-turn and thought, those are the stories I want to write. I want people to understand just how agonising it is living with the aftermath of a violent crime.
I couldn't agree more. I actually lived on the Tasman Peninsula after the Port Arthur massacre.
Yeah.
And it was a dreadful time, of course. Now, you wrote about the survivors of that Port Arthur massacre.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I was covering the cases for magazines, and I'd had the first interview with Walter Micak, whose wife and 2 little children were among the last of Martin Bryant's victims. And he wanted the murders to count for something. He didn't want people to revere the name of Martin Bryant. Won't even say the name in any of the stories I've done. And I get that. So he wanted it to count for something. So with the help of other people like John Bertrand and other significant people, he set up the Alana and Madeline Foundation as a legacy to his 2 little girls who died that day. And I did a lot of the work in setting that up.
Oh, really?
Publicly.
Yes.
So I wrote the early stories, and the first recipient, it was for at the time it was child survivors of violent crime, and the first recipient was a little Indigenous boy called Jandamara O'Shane, who was a little boy in Cairns when some guy with issues got into the playground with a can of petrol, doused him in petrol and set him alight. He was only 5, and that little boy went to hell and back. So he was the first recipient to benefit from this trust fund that Walter set up.
Yes.
And later on I went on to do other stories on Walter when he married Kim Sporton, who was the Channel 7 sports reporter, and when their daughter Isabella was born. So I had a lot to do with Walter over many years, and how it still amazes me how people come back.
I know, it's absolutely extraordinary, and particularly in that case. Yeah. And I go back to the peninsula many times, usually once or twice a year, and it's still having a huge effect on a lot of people.
I think it always will.
Down there, as a lot of the crimes. But from there, now you went on to, or you've gone on, I should say, to write many books. In fact,
Yes.
one that's just come out recently is your 7th book, I think.
Eighth,
isn't it?
actually.
Oh,
It's my
eighth. Yes, yes.
So it's called Look What You Made Me Do.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I was going to go through, because we won't have time to go through
No.
the whole 8, but I was going to concentrate, if that's all right with you, on the last 3 books
Yes.
that you've done. And the first one, which I must admit I've read them all, and you can't say that they're an enjoyable read.
They're not
because
easy
they,
reading.
Yes, they're not easy reading, but they are terrific from the point of view of how you manage to get into people's lives, which I think is just incredible. But Out of the Ashes, which is the book that you wrote on the Therese Fox, who's
Yeah.
the survivor of the Bali bombings,
Yeah.
was an incredible story. Not only Teresa's story, which I think is incredible. They called her the doctors nicknamed her the Miracle of Bali.
Yes.
But it also showed the wonderful friendship that turned out to be between the 2 girls that actually befriended her in Bali,
Yes,
and
totally.
then have looked after her so well. And at the book launch on the Gold Coast, they were there. And
They were there, and I think that's one thing that struck me in looking at Therese's story. And I've known Therese.
Yes.
I met Therese 9 months after the Bali bombings, and she was in a full pressure bodysuit, terribly burnt, and her life was still in danger at that time. 9 months after Bali, she got an infection of the mastoid in the ear that could have invaded her brain, and she was terribly ill. And everyone else had gone home from hospital by then, but not Therese. Right. So I've interviewed her many times over 19 years, and she came back to me in 2021, late 21, saying, I think I'd like to tell my story in a book. The 20th anniversary was coming up.
Oh, of course,
in
yes.
2022, and she felt it had taken her all of that time to get her life back on track. And she shared her story, and what touched me about that story is all the other people whose lives crossed paths on that night
Yes.
with Therese, who by fate were there for one reason or another, and the friendships that grew from the ashes of Bali and where they all are now. So Kath Byrne and Radha van der Werth,
Yes,
who
I
are
was
teachers
lucky enough
from,
to meet, yes.
from the Sunshine Coast, who happened to have just arrived there
Yes.
just as it all happened, and they helped to save Therese's life, how their lives were touched by it.
Yes.
And very recently, that book won the Davitt Award for Best Non-Fiction 2022. And I rang Therese to say we'd been nominated.
Yes.
And it was the Australian Sisters in Crime Davitt Awards.
Right, right.
And she said, can I come?
Oh.
I would love to come to the awards. And I said, yes, there's no guarantee we'll win anything, but I think it's so important. So she came to the awards and brought her daughter, Katie.
Oh, okay.
And Katie's now the age Therese was.
Oh, right.
When Therese was blown up by, the suicide bomber came
Yes.
in behind her and detonated a
Yes.
suicide vest. So Katie came, and her best friend, Teresa's best friend, came, and my husband came. And it was such a celebration when we won. It was just such a celebration. And one of the judges said afterwards, which is such a compliment, it was an undisputed winning book.
Yes.
Because it was so raw and so confronting, but because it was such an important story to see how people do, the resilience that people show.
And exactly, and then the reaction, how people react as those
Yes.
that they just came to her aid, and
They
then
did.
they continue to do that, and are to this very day. And you almost feel as though, I did at your book launch down on the Gold Coast, feel as though it's sort of part of a family that's been brought together, isn't it?
Totally. And they shared that pride, They're part of that story is also their story of
Yes.
Bali.
Yes.
And Radha said that to me. That story is my story too. It's what happened to me in Bali. And Kath, who's now gone to Jakarta, she's a teacher. She's recently gone to work in Jakarta at an international school.
Oh, okay.
She just rang me last week and said, could you please post me some copies of Out of the Ashes?
Right.
Because I've got people here that would like to read it. So
I think it's a story that so many people, as
Yes.
it turned out, at your book launch on the Gold Coast, which was absolutely packed. In fact, I think you had to do 2 book launches
did
there,
too,
didn't
yes.
you? Yeah, to cover them. But it is a remarkable story of survival. So. You're listening to Lots to Chat About. I'm Rosemary Peterswald, and my guest today is award-winning author Megan Norris. How do you manage to put yourself in the situation of something like that, but then be able to get on with your own life? You know, you're sitting at your typewriter 1 minute writing the horrendous thing that happened to Therese, but then the next minute you've got to sort of think, well, what am I going to have for dinner? And
it is, when I'm working in that space with Therese's book, because she asked me late 2021, and then we got a deal on the table with Big Sky Publishing. When I was writing that, I had to work 12 days a week, 7 days a week, with Good Friday off until the end of June to get it to print, to have it proofed, edited at the printers and distributed to be on shelves for the anniversary in October.
Gosh.
So afterwards I ended up in the cardiac unit at the Gold Coast Hospital with a suspected heart attack.
I'm not surprised.
I think I was working at such a frenzied pace that even I wasn't aware of it.
Right.
And I think as well, I'm always very mindful, it's not my story.
No.
It's someone else's. It's not my grief.
Yes.
But my job is to do the story justice. Yes. And I think that's the hardest thing when someone like Therese entrusts you to write the worst thing that ever happened to them, put it into words.
Yes.
And I try and do that by getting a bigger picture from everyone, which is why I got all the other stories. And the hardest thing, I think, is people have trusted you. Will I have the words? Will I be able to find the words to do that story justice, to do her suffering justice? Yes. And I obviously did, because it made every single judge on Sisters in Crime cry.
Right, I'm not surprised.
I think I did the job.
I certainly had tears in my eyes when I was reading it. But it was just lovely to see her with you that day, and see that she had come through, which was terrific, obviously, with a lot of scars and whatever internally and externally, but there she was, and
it was wonderful.
She had survived.
And John Howard wrote an endorsement for the former Prime Minister for the back of the book, in which he said she was the story of resilience and hope and the power of love, and the power of the human spirit not to be defeated. And I think that said it absolutely all. I was so thrilled that he wrote that for us.
It's wonderful that he did, and so true. Which brings me to your next book, which is the Messiah Bride, which is the story of Stephanie Heinrich, who dreamed, as I say, of owning a horse, leaving school and marrying Ken Reeves, but God had other plans. She was forced to become a false prophet's bride, one of 84 mystical spouses, chosen by the Lord to bear 27 children for the prophet's new heavenly dynasty. So how on earth did you get involved in that, and then how did you cope writing about it and being there for so long?
Well,
as
that
Stephanie
was
related her story.
Again, with all the books, I've written 8 books now. Every time I've been approached to write the book, I'm not an ambulance chaser. You know, it's not like, hey, you've got a great story to tell. Would you like to?
People approach you, and I'm not surprised.
Always do. Yes. And they're people that you've formed a trust and a relationship with over many years.
Yes.
So originally, I interviewed Stephanie for a magazine years before. And so she came back to me years later saying, or many years later, that she'd like to tell her story in a book. What did I think? But how would that work with me living in Melbourne and her living on the Gold Coast? And I said, well, actually, I've moved. And I just moved to the Gold Coast. And she said, whereabouts are you living? And I said, Runaway Bay. And she said, I live in Runaway Bay. Whereabouts in Runaway Bay. And we were living 2 streets away from one another. Oh. So we sort of thought it was meant to be. That book.
It sounds as though it was, yes. But again, a remarkable survival story. So you've just done a reprint of Look What You Made Me Do, for which you won the Sisters in Crime Davitt Award for the best non-fiction. And that was focusing on 7 different but equally harrowing cases of spousal revenge.
Yes, I wrote Look What You Made Me Do in 2015, where I looked at 7 separate cases where children had been murdered by their own biological fathers during a marital breakdown. Right. And there were themes that I found. And that book won the 2016 Davitt Award. But over the years, 8 years later, the domestic violence landscape has changed. But these crimes have not.
No.
In fact, they're worse. And so I was asked if the book was, the publisher that I worked for had had been taken over by another publisher. So the rights were assigned back to me. And Big Sky, who'd just done Out of the Ashes, asked if I would like to update that book. So I said, well, things have changed a lot in 8 years. So I revisited all my research, which was completely out of date. And I did 2 more recent crimes. So I've done more crimes, more research, and a new introduction completely with more data. And we looked at coercive control. So the last 2 crimes, the new crimes I've added, which is the case of Hannah Clark from Brisbane, who and her 3 little children were set on fire by a vengeful ex to punish her for leaving the relationship. And I looked at the case of Robert Edwards, who murdered his 2 teenage children in Sydney by shooting them, executed them really at point blank range with a high-powered pistol to pay his wife back for leaving the marriage, a very abusive marriage. And I'm asking the question, like lots of people realise now, I think we're more aware that 1 woman dies every week as a result of inter-partner violence. Right. And another 10 are admitted to hospital every single day with injuries inflicted by a spouse or former partner. What people don't know is that 1 Australian child dies every 2 weeks at the hands of a biological or step-parent.
An innocent victim, aren't they?
And they're not even the true targets. I think they're the only child murders I've ever done, where the victims are not actually the target. No. The target is the former partner. So the disgruntled spouse will kill the kids who become collateral damage in a crime that's actually aimed at making their mother pay.
Exactly.
For the rest of her life.
And it does.
And it does. It's an endless suffering. But out of the cases I've done, 9 cases, they're all very... A number of the women wanted to be interviewed and spent ages with me giving their interviews, sharing their stories, because they want people to know it's still happening.
It is, yes. And
every day.
Incredible. And as you said, and I just said before, is that it's the children, the innocent children that are the victim. And it's the mother or the wife that would just never, ever get over.
And they're not meant to. They're meant to take that suffering to their grave. And look, Cindy Gambino, whose 3 little children were driven into a dam on Father's Day 2005 by their angry dad and left to drown.
Right.
He wasn't angry with the kids. He was angry with Mum. He wanted to pay her back for leaving. Yes. So he drove the car into a dam, swam away and left the kids to drown. He claimed he'd had a coughing fit, which was rubbish. Right. It was payback murder. Yes. It's called retaliatory filicide. Yes. And, that case haunts me. I covered that case for 8 years, and Cindy died at 50.
Right.
And she said to me years ago, she was in her 30s when the kids were killed, I don't think I'll live a long life because it's not possible to live with this level of grief.
Look, there was a dreadful case in Tasmania where a father, again, a strange marriage, and he killed the 4 daughters. And the mother there, I mean, she carried on for a few years, and then she died.
And the same in the Edwards
case. You just
case.
Can't carry that amount of grief with you.
Well, she said, I'll die of a broken heart.
Yes.
And after she died, a new husband rang me to tell me, and he said she had, they did a test on her heart. She suffered a cardiac episode from which she never recovered, but they found a large, thick scar running right down the middle of her heart. She'd never had heart surgery.
Right.
And she'd never had a heart attack.
Yes.
And he said, what about that? She did die of a broken heart.
I can quite imagine. Do you ever think of writing fiction?
Actually, I have been thinking about it. My mother told me she hates my books.
Oh.
She doesn't read them. She never reads a word I write. They're all too grim and miserable and upsetting. And she can't, why do you have to write such grim and miserable books?
Yes.
Why don't you write something with a happy ending? And I said, but I do, because these people survived. The mothers in this book survived, most of them.
Yes.
And their families are sharing their stories to teach, to teach or to raise awareness.
Yes.
But she said, why don't you write something else? And it got me thinking. And one of my friends said, because I've got quite an interesting career, because I've done everything from, I've done press releases for Pink. I covered the launch of the Red Bull racing car team in the Formula One Grand Prix, the biggest party Australia's ever seen. Oh, wow. And I did all the press releases for Red Bull about Pink, their guest star, being flown out. And I did funny court stories. I mean...
And you said you did the publicity for ovarian cancer.
I did publicity for ovarian cancer. I worked for Variety, right? Yes. I've worked for just about everybody. Make-A-Wish, I've written stories for Make-A-Wish.
Right.
Happy's feel-good stories. But I've done some hilarious crime, because crims are not very bright. The jails are full of them.
Yeah.
So, I've thought of I actually went back to The Truth, to my cuttings from The Truth, and looked at some of the crazy stories I did for The Truth, which are laugh out loud.
Right.
Like laugh out loud stuff. And I think I might do like a funny book.
I think, honestly, the way you write, and I must admit, I don't know how you do it, but it is incredible writing. So, and you certainly would have enough ideas to write fiction, and I would imagine you'd be fantastic at it. But do you have any more real-life crime books?
I've been following a very big case, and I've always got stuff on the go. But I've been thinking that some of the cases that I've covered that are too problematic legally to write about true crime, because there's legal loopholes that I can't go there. But if it were fiction, I could use the truth, that true stories as a basis for a great fictional book.
Yes.
Set somewhere else with different characters. But I am thinking of writing funny. I've decided my mum might be right, and I might need a laugh in my life.
I think that would be very good. And what I must point out to our listeners is that your books are on audio. Which you actually read one of them, isn't it? Which is the one that you most recently read yourself?
The Messiah's Bride, which is a Penguin book. I read the audio for that. And that was a tricky one because the family are German and there were some very long German names and castles I had to get my tongue around. So I think I was a bit more practiced dealing with a German family over many years. And then we had a lovely actress, read Out of the Ashes. They wanted an Australian. It's an Australian story of an Australian survivor. They did not want my irritating English voice. Oh. So they got a lady called Vivian Carter, who's an Aussie, to do it. And she's done a beautiful job. Right. And then this Look What You Made Me Do, they've got an Australian actress called Ella James, who's better known as the chocolate-voiced vixen. Oh. And she's done the voiceover for this, or the narrative for this, and she's excellent.
Oh, terrific. So the last 3 books that Megan has written, which are available now, is Out of the Ashes, The Messiah's Bride, and Look What You Made Me Do. But Megan Norris, thank you so much for coming in and chatting to us. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you for having me.
Have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.